It was the 9th of March, a Tuesday, and the sky that morning was the color of a nickel that's been in your pocket too long, flat and gray with no give to it. 29 degrees when I stepped out onto the loading dock behind the Hollis County Hatchery, and I remember the exact number because I'd been standing there in that cold for 11 minutes waiting for the manager to finish his phone call, and a body counts the minutes when the wind is coming off the equipment yard like that. I was 61 that spring, and I had come to buy nothing. I had come to ask for what they threw away. The manager, a man named Delbert who I'd known 30 years without ever calling him a friend, came out with his coffee and looked at me the way you look at somebody who's asked you for the peelings off your potatoes. He set the cup down on the rail, and he laughed. Not mean, just tired. And he said, "Ada, those are cracks. They're culls. You can't hatch a cracked egg. Everybody knows that." And I said I'd like to try anyway, and he shook his head and told me to help myself. They were going in the bin either way. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Standing on that dock, 29 degrees, with Delbert laughing into his coffee. Now I want to tell you the whole of it, from the trash bin to the pond, because it took the better part of a year, and it taught me something I'd been carrying half-read in a drawer for 2 decades. But first you have to understand what a cracked egg means to a hatchery, and why a woman my age would drive 40 minutes on a Tuesday to load somebody's garbage into the bed of a truck. A commercial hatchery like Delbert's runs on volume and on certainty. They set eggs by the tens of thousands, and every egg that goes into an incubator takes up a slot, takes up heat, takes up somebody's time to candle it and turn it. So the rule is simple and it is unforgiving. Any egg that comes off the truck with a hairline in the shell, any egg that got jostled, any egg with a soft spot or a star crack from a bump in transit, gets pulled at grading and thrown in a lined bin by the wash sink. The reasoning is sound as far as it goes. A crack lets bacteria in. A crack lets moisture out, and a bad egg in a warm incubator can go off and spoil the ones around it. So they cull, and they cull hard, and they don't lose sleep over it, because at their scale the numbers work. 300 culls out of 40,000 set is nothing to them. It's a rounding error. It's the cost of doing business fast. I stood there and I counted as I loaded, because I count everything. It's a habit my mother left me. 280 eggs. That morning, duck eggs. Big pale green and cream-colored things, most of them khaki Campbell, and a good number of what looked to be Welsh Harlequin by the shade of them. 280 cracked duck eggs in the bottom of a plastic bin, and every one of them written off before 8 in the morning. The difficult ground, if I can call it that, was my pond. And I should tell you about the pond, because the pond is the whole reason any of this started, and the pond is a piece of trouble that ran in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather dug that pond in 1934 by hand and by mule to water stock in a dry corner of the place. It's a little under 2 acres, spring-fed on the north side, and it sits in a low fold of ground that never wanted to grow anything worth harvesting. My father tried to make it pay. He stocked it with catfish in the 50s and lost most of them to a summer kill when the water went low and warm. He tried ducks once, store-bought ducklings, a dozen of them, And the snapping turtles and the mink took 11 inside a month. And he gave it up as a bad job and said the pond was cursed ground, which is what my family said about anything that beat us twice. Difficult, we called it. That corner of the place was difficult. And difficult in my family was a word we used the way other people used the word cursed, a way of quitting that let you keep your pride. So the pond sat. For most of my life, it sat there being difficult, a low green eye of water with cattails creeping in on the west end, and nothing on it but the wild mallards that stopped over in the fall and left again. And I had a mind, that winter I turned 61, that I was tired of the pond being difficult. I wanted it to be something. I'm a widow. My husband Roy passed in the spring of 2019, and the place had gotten quiet in a way that a person can stand for a while, and then can't. I wanted ducks on that water. I wanted to walk out in the morning and see the pond be full of something living that I had put there. But I didn't want to buy ducklings and feed the turtles again. My father had proved that road twice over. What I wanted was a flock that hatched right there, that knew the water from the shell, that came up wild enough to look after itself. And I didn't have the money to buy 100 point-of-laid ducks even if I'd wanted to, which I didn't, because bought ducks are somebody else's idea of a duck, and I wanted my own. Here is where the record comes in, and I have to slow down and tell it right because this is the part that matters. My grandmother, my father's mother, was a woman named Cora, who I barely remember. She died when I was 6. But she kept books, not diaries, not the flowery kind, but hard little ledgers, black-covered things she bought at the feed store, and in them she wrote down the running of the farm in a hand so small and even it looks like it was printed. When my father passed in 2011, I cleaned out the house and I found a box of them, 11 ledgers running from 1928 to 1953. And I kept them because you keep such things, and I put them in a drawer in the spare room, and I did not read them for a very long time. That February, the month before I stood on Delbert's dock, I had been up in the night the way you are at my age, and I got to going through that drawer and I pulled out the ledger marked 1941 to 1944. And in the spring pages of 1942, in among the egg counts and the butter weights and the price of feed, my grandmother had written a thing about ducks. She'd hatched ducks under hens, and she'd hatched them under a broody muscovy. And she had written, and I'll read it to you the way she wrote it, "A duck egg wants damp more than it wants fussing. The hatchery man throws away the cracked and calls them dead. A crack is not death. A crack is a door left open, and a door can be shut with a little wax and a little patience, and a duck don't care how she got into the world so long as she gets there wet and warm." I read that twice by lamplight. A crack is a door left open, and a door can be shut. I read it a third time. And then she'd written the line that I have carried with me every day since, the line that turned out to be the whole of it. The slow way is only slow to them that's watching. To the egg, it is exactly the right speed. The slow way is only slow to them that's watching. To the egg, it is exactly the right speed. Now I want to be honest with you, because this story isn't worth telling if I dress it up. I did not act on that at once. I read it in February, and I closed the ledger, and I told myself I was too old to be sealing cracked eggs with wax like a woman in 1942, and I put it back in the drawer. And the one person I told was my neighbor Verna, who is 74 and has forgotten more about poultry than the county extension office will ever learn. who has been my closest friend since Roy died and never once tried to fix me, only to sit with me. I drove over to Verna's on a cold, clear evening, and I told her about the ledger and about the cracked eggs, and I waited for her to tell me it was foolishness. She didn't. She poured me coffee, and she sat down across the kitchen table and she asked me practical things, which is Verna's whole way of loving a person. She asked how big a crack Cora meant. She asked what I meant to seal them with. She asked, did I have a way to keep humidity up? Because she said the trouble with duck eggs isn't heat, it's damp. And hatcheries run dry to keep bacteria down and lose duck eggs doing it. She asked, did I have a broody hen, or was I going to run an incubator? She asked, last of all, what I thought I'd do with 100 ducks if by some miracle they lived. And I told her I'd put them on the pond, and she looked at me a long moment and said, your daddy's pond. That water's owed something. That was the whole of her judgment. That water's owed something. And that was enough. So I went and looked at the ground before I did anything else, because Cora's ledger had taught me that much already, that you read the thing before you fight it. I put on my boots and I walked the pond the next morning, the ground still hard, and I made myself do what my father never did, which was to understand why the pond kept killing what we put on it. And I stood there a good long while, near half an hour, just watching the water and the banks. And I want to tell you that standing still and watching is a skill, and most people have lost it. I made myself look at it and see the actual thing. Here is what I saw. The west end, where the cattails had crept in, was a shallow shelf, maybe 8 to 10 inches of water over a soft muck bottom, and that shelf ran a good 40 feet out. That shallow, mucky, weedy end was exactly why the fish had died in the heat, because it warmed too fast and the water went low and stale there in August. My father had seen that shelf as a defect. A duck wants exactly that shelf. Ducks want shallow, warm water, full of weed and snail and bug to dabble in, and they want cover to nest in, and that cattail end that had beaten my father's catfish was the finest duck habitat you could design. The thing that made the pond difficult for one animal made it perfect for another. The pond wasn't cursed ground. It was misread ground. It had been waiting 60 years for somebody to put the right creature on it. The predators were the real problem, the turtles and the mink that had taken my father's dozen. And I studied that too. The snappers laid up in the deep east end and in the muck of the shallows. The mink came along the creek that fed the spring on the north side. Those were real, and a store-bought duckling dropped in that water would go the same way my father's did. But a flock that hatched right there and grew up wary, a flock that was 50 and 60 and 80 strong instead of a dozen, a flock that had a whole pond to spread across, that was a different arithmetic. You don't beat the turtles. You outnumber them, and you outwise them. Cora had a line for that too, further back in the ledger. She wrote that you don't clear the varmints off a place. You raise stock that's smart enough to share it, manage it, she meant. You don't conquer a pond, you manage a pond. So that was the plan, though it took me those few days to have the nerve to call it a plan. 280 cracked eggs, most of them dead already, by every rule the hatchery lived by. Seal the cracks the way Cora said hatch. What would hatch? Put whatever ducklings I got onto that misread shelf of shallow water in numbers big enough to outlast the turtles, and let them grow up wild and wet and warm the way a duck was meant to. And I understood, standing there in the cold, that the wax and the eggs were the least of it. The hard part was going to be the patience. It was going to be the 28 days of turning eggs and watching humidity and not knowing if I was tending life or tending a bin of rot. It was going to be the whole spring of not knowing. The method wasn't a trick. It was a system, and the system was mostly waiting done correctly. I went and got the eggs the 9th of March, which is where I started this. 280 of them, and Delbert laughing and me not laughing back. I brought them home, and I laid them out on towels on the big table in the spare room, and I candled every one of them that first night with a little bright flashlight held to the fat end, and I sorted them the way a person sorts anything they mean to save. I threw out 41 of them straight off, the ones cracked clean through, the ones weeping, the ones that smelled even faintly wrong, because Cora's ledger was plain that a rotten egg will take its neighbors with it, and you call the truly dead without sentiment. That left me 239 eggs, with cracks I judged to be doors left open, and not deaths. Now, the sealing. Cora used wax, plain beeswax, and I had half a block of it in the pantry from a year I'd tried candle making, so I used what she used. You warm it just to melting, no hotter, and you take a small clean brush and you paint the crack, and just the crack, a thin line of it, following the hairline so you close the door, without smothering the whole shell, because the egg has to breathe through the rest of the shell or the duckling drowns in there. It is fussy, close work, and my hands aren't what they were. And it took me the whole of 2 evenings, the 9th and the 10th, sitting under the good lamp with a magnifying visor Roy used to use for tying flies. And I'll tell you, somewhere in the 2nd evening, painting wax by lamplight, the way a woman had done at that same task 80 years before. In that same county, I stopped feeling foolish. That's the only way I can say it. I didn't have a proper incubator. I had Roy's old tabletop still air unit that we'd used years back for chickens, a homely thing, and I had to make it right for ducks, which is a different animal than a chicken egg entirely. Duck eggs wanted wet, humid as a bathroom, and that is exactly what the hatchery starves them of. I set the temperature to 99.5 degrees, which is where a still air unit wants to run measured at the top of the egg, and I fought the humidity the whole first week until I hit on the answer, which was a sponge and a shallow pan. And by the end, I was running it at 55 to 60% humidity for the main stretch, and I meant to take it up over 65 for the hatch. I could only fit 72 eggs in Roy's unit at a time. So I did the arithmetic, and I saw I'd be running 3.5 batches, and I built a second homely rig out of a cooler and a heat lamp on a thermostat and a pan of water. Cost me $31 in parts from the hardware in town. And between the two, I could run 144 eggs at once and do the 239 in 2 overlapping rounds. And you have to turn them. That's the labor nobody tells you about. A duck egg wants turning 3 to 5 times a day, an odd number, so it doesn't sit the same way every night, all the way through to day 25 when you stop and let them settle for the hatch. I marked every egg with a pencil, an X on one side and an O on the other, the way Cora wrote to do, so I could see at a glance which had been turned. 239 eggs, turned by hand 5 times a day for the better part of 4 weeks. I set an old kitchen timer, and I did it at 6, at 10, at 2, at 6 again. My whole spring bent itself around that timer. I want to tell you about the day the county came, because that was the low point, and I won't pretend it wasn't. It was the 2nd of April, a Wednesday, and I had the first round of eggs sitting at day 24, right at the edge of hatch. There was a young fellow from the extension office, name of Marcus, come out about something else entirely, a cost-share program on my hayground, and while he was there he asked what all the humming was in the spare room, and I made the mistake of showing him proud. He looked at my 2 homely rigs, and my hand-turned waxed eggs. He got a careful look on his face, the look a young, educated person gets when an old one is about to embarrass herself. He said, real gentle, that cracked hatching eggs had a viability of near 0 in the literature, that I was likely looking at a contamination risk, and had I thought about the salmonella exposure handling that many culls, and did I know that even sound duck eggs run maybe a 65% hatch under ideal conditions, and mine were anything but ideal. He wasn't cruel. He was just certain. The way the young are certain, the way Delbert was certain, the way my father was certain the pond was cursed. He gave me a pamphlet on egg-borne pathogens, and he left, and I stood in that spare room with 100 and something eggs at day 24, and I felt the whole weight of every certain person come down on me at once. That was the doubt night. That very night. I couldn't sleep, and I got up and I got Cora's ledger, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I read it again the whole spring of 1942. And I read the line again out loud in the empty kitchen. The slow way is only slow to them that's watching. To the egg it is exactly the right speed. And I understood that Marcus and Delbert and my own father were all of them watching. They were watching, and they had decided, from watching, that the thing couldn't be done. But the egg wasn't watching. The egg was just doing what an egg does at exactly the speed it does it, wax or no wax, doubt or no doubt. And I decided, sitting there at near 2 in the morning, that I would trust the egg over the audience. I went back to bed and I slept. The first pip came on the 5th of April, day 28, on the first round. I heard it before I saw it, a tiny scratching, a peeping from inside a shell, that every rule I'd been handed said was dead trash. And then, over the next 2 days they came, one after another, wet and ugly and staggering and alive, breaking out of eggs, with my grandmother's wax still dried in a thin seam. I counted, because I count everything. Out of the first round of 144 waxed eggs, 91 ducklings hatched. Out of the second round of 95 viable eggs, I'd lost some to a bad night when the cooler rig spiked warm. I got 60. Now let me give you the honest total, because honest numbers are the only kind worth stating. 239 sealed eggs went in. 151 ducklings came out and lived past the first week. That's a 63% hatch out of eggs that a commercial hatchery had thrown in the trash as dead. 63%. The same rate Marcus quoted me for perfect sound uncracked eggs under ideal conditions from the garbage. From wax and patience and a cooler, raise them up in the barn through the cold end of spring in stock tanks under lamps. And this is where Cora's other wisdom paid, because I raised them hard, which is to say I raised them wary, Didn't coddle them. I let them learn weather and space, and I put them out on the water in bunches as they feathered, onto that shallow, warm shelf on the west end that had beaten my father and a flock 150 strong is a different thing on the water than a dozen. The turtles took some. I won't lie to you, I lost 11 ducks over that first spring and summer to snappers, and I lost 4 more to a mink before I sorted the fencing on the creek side. 15 ducks lost. But 15 out of 151 is a thing you can stand, where 12 out of 12 is a defeat. You don't beat the pond, you manage the pond. You outnumber what you can't outfight. By the middle of that following spring, a full year on almost to the week, I walked out one morning and I stood at the edge of my grandfather's misread water, and it was covered. 130-some ducks, khaki Campbells and Welsh harlequins dabbling that shallow shelf, nesting in the cattails that had once been the pond's great defect, and the Campbell hens were laying, which anybody who knows ducks will tell you is what a khaki Campbell does better than near any bird alive. My pond was full of layers, the difficult corner of the place, the cursed ground, 3 generations of quitting, and it was full of living ducks that had hatched out of a hatchery's trash bin. Marcus came back, the neutral one, the certain young man that following June. He heard about it, and he drove out on his own time with a clipboard and one of those laser thermometers and a little meter for the water. And he walked my pond, and he measured things, and he wrote things down, and he candled a few of the pond-laid eggs and checked the ducklings, and he was quiet a good while. Then he stood at the edge of the water, and he said, and I'll give it to you plain the way he gave it to me. I can't make the numbers say this should have worked. And I didn't say anything. I let it sit. That's not in any manual I've got. And I told him it was in a manual. It was in a ledger from 1942. And I'd be glad to let the extension office copy the pages. He took me up on it. He photographed every page of Cora's Spring of 1942. And I'm told there's a copy of my grandmother's duck notes in the county extension files now, under her name, Cora, filed with the modern pamphlets. That was recognition enough for her. That was more than enough. Delbert, I saw at the feed store in the fall, he'd heard. Everybody had by then. He didn't make a speech. He's not a speech kind of man, and neither am I. Hair. He just tipped his cap back and said, "Guess I threw out a lot of ducks over the years, Ada." And I said, guess he had. That was all either of us said about it, and it was the right amount. So that's the whole of it, from the nickel-gray morning on the loading dock to a pond full of layers. And I've thought a good deal about why it worked, and I keep coming back to the same place. It worked because I stopped watching the eggs the way everybody else watched them, as a thing that was already dead, and I let them go. At the speed they were always going to go. The slow way is only slow to them that's watching. To the egg, it is exactly the right speed. My grandmother wrote that 80 years before I read it, and she was right. And my father never read it and died, believing his pond was cursed ground when all it was misread. A crack is not death. A crack is a door left open. And difficult, that word my whole family hid behind. Difficult mostly just means nobody yet had troubled to read the thing patiently enough to see what it was actually good for. I'm 62 now, and I sit on the bank most mornings with my coffee and watch 130 ducks work water that beat 3 generations of my people. And I'm not proud exactly. Proud's too loud a word for it. I'm satisfied. There's a difference, and it took me a lifetime to learn it. Now I've told you about my stubborn ground, and the cracked eggs my family in half the county wrote off as dead. I expect a lot of you have a piece of ground like that, or a thing everybody around you has agreed can't be done. Some door they've all decided is shut, that you've got a notion might just be open. I'd truly like to hear about it. Tell me down in the comments about your own difficult corner, the thing you're patient enough to read slow, and let's see what the ground's got to say when somebody finally stands still long enough to listen.